So, 3 Republican governors just went behind Donald Trump's back and asked Canada to restart trade. Not 3 Democrats, not 3 never-Trumpers, not 3 critics who have spent years looking for opportunities to break with the administration. 3 Republicans, 3 men who carried Trump's endorsement, who stood on stages beside him, who voted for his agenda and built their political capital on their alignment with his. 3 men who looked at what 4 months of the 25% tariff had done to the $760 billion trade relationship their constituents depend on, and made a decision that, by every norm of American political conduct, should have been unthinkable. They reached out, privately and deliberately, to their Canadian counterparts, without telling the White House, without notifying the President, without requesting permission from anyone in the federal government, and asked Canada to quietly resume trade discussions. Trump was never told. According to 3 separate sources with direct knowledge of the outreach, the White House did not know this was happening. No one in the West Wing was briefed. No one in the National Security Council was consulted. The Office of the United States Trade Representative, the federal agency whose entire mandate is precisely this kind of diplomatic contact, was kept completely in the dark. The conversations were conducted through back channels that bypassed official diplomatic infrastructure entirely, at a level of deliberate concealment that sources describe as extraordinary, even by the standards of an era that has produced extraordinary things almost daily. When the outreach was discovered, and it was discovered, one source inside the administration described the internal reaction as volcanic. A second source said the fallout lasted 2 days and produced a level of internal fracture that has not surfaced in any official statement. A third source, familiar with the communications between the White House and the governor's offices, used a specific word that, in 30 years of covering Washington, this source said they had never before heard applied to members of the president's own party by members of his own administration. Warren Buffett responded with the kind of flat, devastating clarity that has made him the most trusted voice on American institutional dysfunction in the world. When elected officials of your own party are working around you to fix what your policy broke, Buffett said, the strategy isn't failing. It's already failed. When you understand who these 3 governors are, what they told the Canadians, what the Canadians said in return, and what the White House did when it found out, you'll understand why senior Republican operatives are now using a word they have never used about this administration before. Hit subscribe, because what these 3 governors started is not finished, and where it goes next changes everything. Let me walk you through how we got here, because men like these 3 governors do not take actions like this without a very long runway of economic pain behind them. For the better part of 4 months, Republican governors, not Democrats, not opposition critics, not foreign governments, have been watching the Canada trade dispute from the perspective of people who actually have to govern the consequences of it. And the consequences, it turns out, look very different when you are standing in front of them rather than describing them from a podium in Washington. Federal officials can characterize the tariff strategy as working. Governors cannot afford to, because the governors have to read the same budget projections that their state economists are producing. And those projections have been doing something that projections in prosperous times do not do. They have been getting worse. Consider what $760 billion in annual trade actually means at the state level. Not as an abstraction, as a physical, operational, daily reality. It means agricultural exports from Midwest states where Canadian buyers represent, in some commodity categories, between 15 and 25% of total annual export volume. The margin between a profitable harvest year and a year that ends with family farms that cannot service the debt they took on to plant the crop. It means automotive supply chains in Great Lakes manufacturing states where integrated cross-border production runs have been operating since before the current governors were in office, and where a Canadian-sourced component, now carrying a 25% tariff, cascades through the entire cost structure of a finished vehicle in ways that cannot be absorbed by the manufacturer, cannot be passed to the consumer at a price the consumer will accept, and cannot be solved by finding an alternative supplier who does not exist. It means softwood lumber and paper products from border states, where mills have already begun adjusting production schedules, not because demand has dropped, but because the math of exporting into a 25% tariff environment no longer closes in a way that justifies keeping the lights on at full capacity. All of this is moving through $14.2 billion a day, every working day, not in a trade surplus quarter, not during an economic peak, 365 days a year, at a volume that represents the deepest bilateral commercial integration between any two countries on the surface of the earth. Most people in Washington don't realize how specifically the states had been raising these concerns before this outreach occurred, not in press conferences, in formal written letters to the relevant federal agencies, in requests for meetings with the Office of the United States Trade Representative that were acknowledged and not scheduled, in private calls to White House liaisons asking for any update on the negotiation timeline that might allow state-level planning to proceed with some information about when the disruption would end. According to sources familiar with those efforts, the response was consistent and clear. The strategy was working, the pressure on Canada was producing movement, and any suggestion of softening the posture was counterproductive to the leverage the administration was building toward a resolution. The problem was that the resolution kept receding. Canada retaliated with $30 billion in counter tariffs. Then $80 billion, with public signals that a third tranche, fully prepared worth $100 billion, was awaiting only the political decision to deploy. The damage to the $14.2 billion daily flow was not decreasing, it was compounding. And the governor's official channels of influence were producing nothing. Then, in the third month, one of the three governors received a private economic briefing from his state's chief trade economist. The numbers in that briefing, specific numbers from specific industries, compared against projection baselines from the same period the prior year, were, according to sources familiar with the governor's reaction, numbers he could not sit with and do nothing. He called the other two. The conversation over the following weeks produced a plan, and the plan was 3 phone calls that Washington never knew about until it was too late. The first call was placed on a Tuesday afternoon, not from a state capital, not on a government line, not through any infrastructure that would generate a record. According to sources familiar with the logistics of the outreach, the governors were deliberate, methodically deliberate, about the channels they used. They needed conversations that would not be captured in the formal diplomatic record, that would not require official documentation creating legal discoverability, and that would allow contact to occur and, if necessary, to be walked back without producing a paper trail that could be used against them or against the Canadians. The Canadian side was reached through an intermediary, not a lobbyist, not a political operative, a person with long-standing professional relationships in both American state government and Canadian provincial government, who had spent decades operating in precisely the space between official and unofficial that has always existed alongside formal diplomacy, and that becomes indispensable precisely when formal diplomacy has stopped functioning. According to sources on both sides of the outreach, this intermediary was known to and trusted by both parties. The Canadian provincial officials who received the contact understood immediately what was being offered, a conversation entirely off the record, with elected American officials who had real political standing, real economic stakes, and who were coming to them outside of the official framework that had made any honest exchange impossible for 4 months. The Canadian side made a decision within 24 hours. According to sources familiar with the timeline, the relevant Canadian counterparts confirmed their willingness to participate without requesting additional assurances, without extensive conditions, and without escalating the contact to federal-level officials in Ottawa. They understood what they had been given, and they treated it accordingly. The conversations that followed took place over 48 hours, spread across 3 separate calls involving different participants on both sides. Understand what that physical context meant. No grand rooms, no formal settings, no cameras or nameplates or flags arranged for the diplomatic photography that normally accompanies any exchange of this consequence. No staff teams preparing talking point binders, no protocol officers managing the agenda, just phones and elected officials speaking to each other with the directness that the complete absence of official structure permits, and that official structure almost never does. On the American side, the governors came with data, not the broad strategic data of a formal trade negotiation, the granular supply chain level data that tells you exactly where the damage is concentrated, exactly which product categories have been most affected, exactly which employment figures have deteriorated most significantly, and exactly what a modest targeted adjustment to the current structure would produce in measurable terms. They were specific because they needed to be. They were not there to perform a position. They were there to have a conversation. The Canadians listened. According to sources familiar with the substance of the calls, the Canadian participants were measured, professional, and notably free of the hostility that had accumulated in the official track over 4 months of escalation. One source familiar with both tracks described the contrast directly. In the official channel, the Canadians had been defending their counter-tariffs and asserting their position with the disciplined language of a government that has decided to hold firm. In these calls, the language was different. The Canadians were speaking like people who had wanted a solution for months and had not found a conversation partner willing to have it until now. There was a specific moment on the second call that changed the character of what was happening. One of the American governors said, "I am not here representing the White House position. I am here representing the people in my state who need this to get better. And I am asking you directly what would need to be true for that to happen." There was a pause, several seconds according to the source, long enough to be uncomfortable, long enough for the governor to wonder whether he had misjudged the room. And then the Canadian official said something that none of the American participants had heard from any Canadian official in 4 months of dispute. He said, "Then let's talk about what better actually looks like." No agreement was reached. No framework was signed. No tariff was modified by what happened on those calls. But something occurred that had not occurred since the trade dispute began. A candid, substantive, honest conversation between elected officials with direct economic stakes in the outcome about what a practical resolution might look like, conducted entirely outside the official structure that had made such a conversation impossible. The intermediary wrote a single note after the final call. According to someone who later saw that note, it said, "They're willing. The question is whether Washington lets us go back." Washington did not know yet. That was Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday. By Friday, someone talked. The disclosure did not arrive as a dramatic leak. There was no whistleblower filing, no newspaper front page, no congressional statement. It came out the way most consequential things in Washington eventually come out. A secondhand mention in a conversation that was supposed to be private, received by someone with a specific reason to pass it forward, which arrived in the right ears on a Friday afternoon, in the manner that Washington has always used to transmit what it officially cannot acknowledge. By Saturday morning, according to sources with knowledge of the White House's internal response, the administration was fully aware that 3 of its own governors had conducted unofficial diplomatic outreach to Canada without the knowledge, the authorization, or the advance awareness of the President of the United States. By Saturday afternoon, awareness had moved to what sources describe as controlled fury. Controlled in the sense that nothing appeared publicly. Fury in the sense that the internal communications were of an intensity that sources say had not been seen since the tariff announcement itself. The governors were contacted directly, not through a formal rebuke in official channels, not through a public statement that would itself become a news event, but in the kind of direct, unambiguous communication that makes political stakes clear without creating a documented record. According to sources familiar with those conversations, the message was consistent. The outreach had exceeded the scope of the governor's authority. It had complicated the official diplomatic track, and it was not to continue. One source described the tone of the communication as a reminder, extended without any ambiguity, of who controls what. The governors did not apologize. They acknowledged what had happened. And they made an argument that the White House, according to sources with direct knowledge of the exchange, did not fully rebut. The argument was simple. The economic damage in their states had reached a threshold that required action. The official track had produced no movement in 4 months, and what they had done was not an act of disloyalty to the president, but an act of fiduciary responsibility to their constituents. The markets reflected a calculation before the weekend was over. Fragments of the story had reached financial desks through the layered network of Washington political intelligence that has always moved faster than official disclosure. The Canadian dollar moved upward against the US dollar, a fraction of a cent, but in a direction and at a pace that trading desks recognized as a signal. Canadian bond markets repriced modestly in a direction consistent with an upward revision to trade resolution probability. And in equity markets, companies with material Canada trade exposure, automotive suppliers, agricultural processors, softwood lumber companies, saw movement that one trading desk attributed directly to what it called a softening of resolution timeline assumptions. $14.2 billion a day is a number that is being calculated continuously. 3 governors making 3 phone calls was enough to move it. The Canadians said nothing publicly, not a word, which was itself, according to diplomatic analysts watching the situation, a deliberate communication. When a party to a trade dispute holds a conversation that the other side could weaponize and chooses not to, they are saying something unmistakable. They are saying the conversation should continue. Warren Buffett understood exactly what that silence meant, and what he wrote in response will be studied in economics classrooms for years. Warren Buffett released his response as a written statement through Berkshire Hathaway's Investor Relations Office, 3 paragraphs, no press conference, no broadcast interview. He has developed over 63 years of sitting at the intersection of capital markets and political governance, a specific instinct for the moments when precision matters more than visibility, and when the substance of what is happening is more important than any performance of responding to it. This was one of those moments, and he knew it before he wrote a single word. 3 Republican governors, Buffett wrote, just told us something that no official statement, no tariff order, and no White House press briefing has been willing to say in 4 months of dispute. They told us the damage is real, it is measurable in their state budgets and their employment figures and their agricultural export data, and it has reached the threshold where elected officials of the president's own party are willing to risk their political futures to address it. I have never, in 63 years of watching American governance, seen that signal misread by the people in a position to act on it. When your own team starts solving the problem you said didn't need solving, the problem needed solving. He continued. Because Buffett always continues when the stakes demand an accounting rather than an epigram. The $760 billion trading relationship between the United States and Canada, he wrote, is not an abstraction. It is $14.2 billion changing hands every single day in agricultural commodities, manufactured goods, energy products, and pharmaceutical materials by real people in real communities who did not vote on trade policy and who cannot reorganize their economic lives around a Washington timeline. Governors understand this in ways that federal officials sometimes forget, because governors cannot move to a different city when the factory closes. They have to stand in front of the people whose livelihoods have changed and explain what happened and when it will change back. Three of them decided they were done waiting for an explanation they could give. And then the paragraph that has been cited in every financial analysis, every geopolitical assessment, every senior policy briefing produced since the statement was released. In 63 years of watching the intersection of markets and governance, Buffett wrote, I have seen trade disputes resolved through patient negotiation. I have seen them resolved through escalation that eventually became too expensive to sustain. I have seen them drag on beyond any rational economic justification because the political cost of ending them exceeded the political cost of continuing them. What I have never seen, not once in 6 decades, is a trade dispute where the resolution momentum was generated by the people the policy was supposed to protect, going around the people managing the policy to find an exit. That is not a resolution. That is a diagnosis. Read that word carefully. Not a warning, a diagnosis. Buffett has used the word deliberately because a warning is something that precedes damage. A diagnosis is something rendered in the presence of damage that already exists. In Buffett's 63-year frame of reference, the moment 3 Republican governors decided the only remaining path to relief for their constituents ran through a back channel their president would never be told about. That was not the beginning of a crisis. It was the visible surface of one that had already been developing for 4 months beneath the official narrative. The economic translation, as Buffett framed it, was precise. A $760 billion relationship doesn't dissolve gradually. It accumulates structural damage that begins as recoverable and becomes, at a certain threshold, irreversible. The $14.2 billion daily flow is not a tap that can be turned back on cleanly after months of artificial restriction. Relationships have been rerouted. Supply chains have begun finding alternatives. And the political conditions required to restore the flow are growing more, not less, complicated with every week that passes. Buffett's verdict, the most powerful country on earth, should not need its governors to do its diplomacy. Today, for 3 phone calls placed through a back channel on a Tuesday afternoon, it did. The consequences of what these 3 governors did and of what the White House's internal reaction to it reveals do not land as a single event. They cascade. They compound in multiple directions simultaneously in ways that the official framing of this dispute as a bilateral federal negotiation consistently obscures. Begin at the state level. The $760 billion annual trading relationship is not evenly distributed. It is concentrated in specific states, specific industries, and specific supply chains that have been built over 60 years around the structural assumption of frictionless cross-border commerce. Agricultural states where Canadian buyers represent a critical share of total export revenue that cannot be replaced by domestic buyers who don't need the product. Manufacturing states where integrated supply chains cross the border multiple times within a single production cycle and where the 25% tariff cascades through the cost structure of every product those chains produce. Border communities where the economy has been organized around the $14.2 billion daily flow so long that disrupting it is not a market adjustment. It is a community crisis. The governors who made those 3 calls are governing those communities. And what they told the Canadians, not in a press release, not in a policy statement, but in a private conversation through a back channel on a Tuesday afternoon, is that the damage has reached a threshold where the official explanation is no longer sufficient. Now add the institutional dimension. What the governor's outreach did, unintentionally, simply by existing and then being discovered, is reveal to Canada that the United States is not a unified actor in this dispute. Canada has spent 4 months dealing with a federal government whose official position was consistent, coordinated, and immovable. The governor's outreach revealed a second channel, a channel that exists below the federal level, outside the official framework, and represents American political will at the level where the actual pain of the policy is being absorbed most directly. That revelation changes the Canadian government's strategic calculation in a specific way. The Canadians now know that the American political system contains actors with real standing, real constituency, real motivation, who want this resolved and who have demonstrated the willingness to act outside the official framework to pursue resolution. That knowledge, once acquired, does not disappear when a tariff eventually gets lifted. It becomes part of how Canada plans. It becomes part of the parallel track that Canada will maintain quietly for as long as the dispute continues and beyond it. The defense layer is the one that official commentary has been most reluctant to examine directly, because it cannot be reduced to a tariff number or a trade figure, and therefore resists the kind of financial analysis that drives most coverage. Canada and the United States share NORAD, the Joint Aerospace Defense Command that has protected North American airspace continuously since 1957. They share Five Eyes intelligence architecture. They share Arctic sovereignty agreements and joint patrol protocols that are growing more, not less, strategically critical as Russian submarine activity in Arctic waters and Chinese commercial presence in the Arctic shipping lanes increases. None of those arrangements are governed by trade agreements. None of them can be suspended by tariff orders, but all of them are sustained by institutional trust that is not renewable on demand. Trust that took decades to build and that is being subjected in this dispute to a stress test that it was never designed to absorb. Beijing has noticed. Moscow has noticed. Every government conducting a serious strategic assessment of North American stability has noticed that 3 Republican governors just told the world something that their president's official communications have been systematically denying, that the economic cost of this dispute has reached a threshold where the political system is routing around itself to find relief. That is information. It is being processed in capitals that plan in decades and that are always calculating the gap between what America says about itself and what America's own officials reveal about the reality beneath the statement. 3 calls, 3 governors, 48 hours of conversations through a back channel, and a cascade of consequences that has only begun to show its shape. What 3 Republican governors did by placing calls that were never supposed to become public through a channel designed to leave no trace, to have a conversation that the official structure had made impossible, was not a betrayal. However the White House characterized it privately, however the political apparatus will frame it in the days that follow, the action itself can only be understood one way. It was the action of elected officials who had run out of official options for addressing economic damage that had become, in their own assessment, no longer tolerable to absorb and then explain to the people who sent them to their state capitals. The $760 billion relationship. The $14.2 billion every single day. 3 governors. These numbers define the geometry of what happened and why it matters. The first number represents the scale of what is at stake in this dispute. The second represents the cost of every additional day it remains unresolved. Not an abstract cost, but a concrete, daily, measurable cost being distributed across the states and communities and industries that were never asked whether they wanted to be the terrain on which this trade war was fought. The third number represents the threshold at which the political system, even from within, even from allies of the administration managing the policy, begins to root around itself to find relief. Warren Buffett wrote that the most powerful country on earth should not need its governors to do its diplomacy. In 63 years of watching American governance, he has seen a great many things he did not expect to see. But that sentence, the one he chose to end his statement with, the one he chose with the precision of someone who understands that a final line must carry the full weight of everything that preceded it, carries a specific gravity that goes beyond trade policy. The governors did their diplomacy anyway, because they made the kind of calculation that is made not in policy offices in Washington, but in state capitals, where the employment projections are deteriorating on a quarterly basis, where the calls from employers are arriving with a frequency and an urgency that no longer permits the comfort of patient waiting, and where the people asking for answers are not analysts or commentators or political allies, but workers and farmers and business owners who need to know whether to plan for next quarter or give up on it. The White House knows what happened. The Canadians know what happened. 3 governors know what they did, why they did it, and according to sources familiar with their private thinking, they do not believe they were wrong. The only question the $760 billion relationship, the $14.2 billion moving daily, and 3 phone calls placed through a back channel on a Tuesday afternoon are together asking is this: whether the people with the constitutional authority and the political standing to convert 3 unofficial calls into an official resolution are capable of seeing what their own party just told them. The governors spoke clearly, in the only language the official structure had left them. What comes next depends entirely on whether anyone with the power to answer was listening.